Welcome, fellow Whovians, back to Unrepentant Geeking, the show where a geek can be a geek. As always, I am your host, Shaun, and it's a new year, and hopefully this time for real, a new start for this show. But first, we've got some unfinished business to take care of. Yes, that's right, it's time for the reviews of the final 2 episodes of Series 11 of Doctor Who, the first season of the 13th Doctor era. Just some quick business to get out of the way first. Obviously, it's been a while since the last episode. As I've mentioned several times, I'd gotten a new computer, and then it seemed like one thing went wrong after another. I ended up having to get a new monitor, I ended up having to get a new microphone cable, then I ended up having to just get a new microphone, and then I had to get a replacement for that microphone, because the initial new microphone I got was a piece of crap that didn't work, and oh god, it was a mess. It was just a mess. But, the mess is all sorted out now. I'm very happy with my new microphone, even if I'm still kind of working out exactly what settings. This one's got a lot more bells and whistles than my old one. I managed to scrap up the money to plunk up a decent amount. I mean, I didn't spend thousands or anything, but I did spend significantly more than I did on my last microphone. Let's just leave it at that. Hopefully this is going to work out well, and I am in the process of trying to set up live streaming. I'm already, think I've picked out if and when I start live streaming what I will do first. At least my first game, assuming I can make it all work, would be trying to do Pillars of Eternity. It's a game I've wanted to play for years, but never really had the opportunity for a number of different reasons, so it feels like a good fit. I love those old school kind of RPGs. It feels like something I could do, hopefully make interesting while doing live streaming with. We'll see, and of course, as trailers, I'm hoping to maybe start doing trailer reactions or other things. You know, we'll play it by ear. Going forward, I will say in terms of scheduling, I'm not looking to do another weekly show again. I don't think my reviews of Doctor Who were bad, per se, this last year, but I also don't know if doing the weekly grind really helped either. So, I do have a number of areas and things I want to cover. We'll get down to that. I'm definitely going to be doing some reviews of things. I've got like a promised review of She-Ra, and I would like to talk about that show at some point. Young Justice, as of this recording, has just started its new season. So yeah, there's definitely going to be more episodes and definitely going to be regular content coming from this channel going forward. And as always, I appreciate all your patience and support. But that's enough of the preamble. Let's get down to business. To defeat the Huns! God damn it, Mulan. Every time I hear that. Let's get started. You know, in some ways, I actually think it worked out rather well that I wasn't able to review the quote-unquote season finale for Doctor Who, this Series 11, the Battle of Ranskoor of Kolos. I didn't come even close to getting that right, did I? Oh, well, it's made-up language anyways. I do try with real languages. I do try. I often fail, but I try. But made-up sci-fi languages, if I get it wrong, meh. Anyways, because really, this wasn't a season finale. Not really. The real season finale awaited us on New Year's Day. But by calling this the season finale, Chris Chibnall and company get to keep their promise of not featuring any familiar Doctor Who faces or foes in this season. And we'll get to that in a minute. But okay, let's at least briefly touch upon the battle this episode. It wasn't the worst episode of the season. Episode 10 of Series 11. Written by Chris Chibnall, directed by Jamie Childs. It was okay. It wasn't terrible. There wasn't a terrible episode of Doctor Who this season, I would argue. And it wasn't the weakest episode of the season. I still think that belongs to Arachnids in the UK, which is just too messy overall. But maybe in some ways, as messy as it is, it's maybe a more interesting messy than the Battle of Ranskoor of Kolos. Because while this isn't the worst episode of the season, it does come pretty close to being the weakest. It's just above Arachnids in the UK. And that's because it does give us some nice, strong moments with what has been one of the strongest elements, one of the best elements of the season, namely the relationship between Graham and Ryan. that relationship, in a way, comes to a head, and we get to see the fallout of that coming to a head in the next episode. And it's really effectively done, even if it's a bit familiar. I don't think anybody likely seriously believed that Graham was going to kill good old Tim Shaw, or Zim Shaw, or Mr. Two-Face, or the Tooth Fairy, but not the good one, the really stupid-looking one. Yeah, I'm not really a fan of that character, and he's a big problem with the episode. Overall, the weaknesses of this episode are the weaknesses that have shown up have been the weakest elements of Chris Chibnall's writing overall. There's too many shortcuts. There's too many, well, this is happening because the plot demands it. The biggest issue is the fact that our aliens, our guest aliens of the episode, namely the Ooks, in theory, they're an interesting race, I guess you would call them. They're not exactly a race. They're a race of two, and they can manipulate reality, and they apparently are familiar with dimensions, and yet at the same time, they seem incredibly stupid because they're so apparently easily tricked by Zim Shaw, and that is the biggest flaw in this episode, is it never does even remotely, not even remotely, a good job of justifying why the Ooks think Zimza is their god. I get that they're religious-minded, but there's never any indication that he apparently resembles their god. And if he does, that's like the biggest effing coincidence, even for a show like this, which is often built on ridiculous coincidence. That goes too far. That is way too damn contrived. And the episode never does anything to justify it. And if Zim Shaw was a more interesting villain, a more interesting character, I might not be as bothered, but unfortunately, he's not. He was perfectly fine in the first episode of the season, because the first episode was a regeneration story. It was our introduction to these characters. It was our introduction to this incarnation of the Doctor. And as such, I'm of a mind to cut it more slack. Obviously, an episode like that has a lot more that it needs to do than worry too much about including a compelling villain. The villain just needs to be interesting enough or good enough to serve as the antagonist, the thread of the episode. And for that context, Tim Shaw was fine. And I actually didn't mind the idea that his race would get further developed across the season, as was potentially hinted in episode 2, but actually didn't obviously happen. And fine, it's something that Chibnall and company can return to down the line if they want, but bringing the actual character of Zim Shaw himself back has not paid any dividends. The episode just doesn't do enough to further develop him. He remains a fairly generic bad guy, not just for Doctor Who, but really for almost any kind of popular genre show for the last few years. And, something like the Daleks arguably aren't the most complicated or interesting characters, but they're compelling villains because they have a striking design, striking execution, and they come off as legitimately intimidating, as we'll cover shortly. Zim Shaw doesn't do any of that. And the show can never commit enough to him. Honestly, what they needed to do was they needed to, I don't know, they needed to give us like a flashback sequence that really let us see how Zim Shaw tricks the Ooks, and make it clear that, like, and the show is never clear on this episode's never clear, like, that it should have made it clear if this was the case, and it should have been. This whole thing was a trap set up for the Doctor. This thing was specifically meant to be revenge for the Doctor. We needed a lot more specificity if this episode was going to work as well as it should have or could have. And if Zim Shaw was going to work as a villain, he needed to be a lot more specific. He needed to be a lot more developed. And the fact that he technically killed Grace, and even then, he's not directly responsible for her death. It's his device, and even then, you could argue that if Graham and her had just stayed back, she wouldn't have even necessarily died. I mean, it doesn't have that weight. And that's not due to a failure for development of Graham or Ryan or even, of the wife. I mean, it's all of it. It could have worked. It's potentially an interesting idea, bringing back Grace's killer, but the show kind of squanders all that. And the rest of the episode, it's fine. There's good moments. There's good scenes. There are individual moments that work quite well. Like I said, I like Graham and Ryan's relationship developing. I like how the 13th Doctor continues to come into focus. I do think that Yaz remains underserved, and that is definitely going to remain the case. That's basically the story of Yaz in season Series 11. But hopefully, and I don't want to go over this too much, hopefully, because I've already talked a lot about it already, hopefully next season she's going to get a lot more to do. Regardless, this wasn't a terrible episode, but it wasn't a particularly memorable one. And if this really had been the finale, I think it would have been fine. And I'm okay, actually. Again, I think part of the problem with some of the earlier series of Doctor Who was they raised the stakes so big, and they kept escalating the stakes. And this was especially true for the 9th and 10th Doctor era. And even the first season of the 11th Doctor era, they just were raising the stakes higher and higher. There was nowhere left to go. And one of the things I liked about the last couple seasons of the Moffat era, the last couple seasons of the 12th Doctor, is that they shrunk the stakes. And it wasn't like there weren't still stakes in those finales. They still felt like big, important episodes. But they didn't feel like the fate of the entire universe was necessarily on the line. It was more the souls of our characters that were at stake. And those are stakes I'm always happy to see. This episode didn't really do that. But as it turns out, it didn't really need to. And that's because, in fact, if not in name, the New Year's special, as opposed to the previously regular Christmas special, the New Year's special of Doctor Who, Series 11, Resolution, written by Chris Chibnall, directed by Wayne Yip, this is the finale. This is the finale for the first season of the 13th Doctor, and wow! You know, I've seen people knocking Chris Chibnall as a writer, and I've seen people talk, showing concern about Chris Chibnall going forward, as if everything Chris Chibnall wrote this season was garbage. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it at all. I thought The Woman Who Fell to Earth was a pretty good regeneration story. I really liked The Ghost Monument. It wasn't a groundbreaking episode, but I thought it did what it needed to do well, and it was pretty well written. I thought Rosa was terrific. Now, admittedly, Maury Blackman clearly helped with that, so you can't give Chibnall sole credit for that, but still, Arachnids in the UK was a weak episode, no question, and much like The Battle, it showcased some of his weaknesses as a writer, but I thought his previous final episode of the season, episode 5, the Saranga Conundrum, I thought that was a really great episode. Maybe a little odd beginning, a little weakness at the start, but had a really good, went to the races from there and had a wonderful ending. So I don't think he's been doing a bad job, and he is the showrunner. Yes, he's got other writers, but there's no question his fingerprints are all over every episode of this season, and that this is his season of Doctor Who as much as it is anyone's. So, and I think Resolution shows that no, Chris Chibnall can write an outright terrific episode of Doctor Who with almost no flaws to speak of, and it really is. And partially, yes, it brings back the Daleks, or should I say, a Dalek, because much like the titular episode Dalek, which in the series that relaunched the Doctor, the 9th Doctor series, and also reintroduced a whole generation to the terror of the Daleks, by narrowing the focus of these characters, this race of evils, to a single figure, and showing just how dangerous they can be, it's really effective at establishing them as true antagonists for the Doctor. And not just antagonists, but ultimate antagonists. Like, the best villains are the ones who can be a dark mirror to our heroes. And what I love about Resolution is how it is in some ways an entire episode that in some ways is a dark mirror to the season premiere, to The Woman Who Fell to Earth. Because in The Woman Who Fell to Earth, we have a Doctor who's in a completely new form, following a very traumatic event, and is more cut off from any of her resources than even she was back when she was the 11th Doctor in the 11th Hour, because at least there was still some access to certain tools and ideas. Here, the Doctor doesn't even know where the TARDIS is. Here, the Doctor has to build her sonic screwdrivers from scratch, using scrap, and we get a similar setup with the Doctor, with the Dalek in this episode, right down to it building a Dalek shell out of scrap. And I thought this is by far the creepiest, the most disturbing, the most intimidating, the most frightening the Daleks have been in a long time. The thing is, the Daleks' popularity has always been something of a double-edged sword. They're very popular, which means people want to see them constantly, but when you have them constantly show up and constantly lose, as they have to do, to the Doctor, it can strip them of their effectiveness as a villain. Because part of the thing is they are supposed to be the most dangerous race in the galaxy. They're supposed to be the most merciless, most cold, most murderous, most effective, conquerors the galaxy, the universe has ever seen. But if they're constantly losing, and they're constantly losing to a wacky old person who rides around in a magic box, well, that could kind of strip them of that. And there's no danger of that in this episode whatsoever. The Dalek Scout is just, the way it takes over Lynn, and the way it violates her, and the way it controls her. And I have to give a lot of credit here. I have to give a lot of credit to Charlotte Ritchie, who just does an outstanding job at performing as Lynn, especially when Lynn is taken over by the Dalek. And the way, there's that moment when the police officer is first approaching, and she gives that little grin, and it's not really her grinning, it's the Dalek. And just, it's like, oh God, chills up the spine, and what it's doing to her. If there's a weakness to her arc, it's that maybe we don't get quite enough resolution with that. I would have liked maybe a bit more of a moment where she actually got to get something back from the Dalek. The Doctor thinks she fought it off, but she didn't really, just let her go. And there's not really a moment where she gets justice for herself. That is a relatively minor complaint overall, but I wish there could have been at least something where something she said was a little more key maybe to defeating the Dalek. That is my biggest quibble with the episode, and overall, I do think it's a relatively minor one. I thought this was terrific, and I liked that this episode, in addition to being a really effective Dalek story, was also a really strong wrap up to the season. It's often been said that until the Doctor, especially in Modern Who, until the Doctor has their first confrontation with the Daleks, they're not really coming to their own. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I definitely think you could make a case for it in this instance at least. I felt like really this crystallized everything. This was the final moment, and by the end of this episode, the 13th Doctor has truly come into her own. And we've seen, there's been a lot of, what often happens in the first season of a new Doctor is we see the character, kind of seesaw back and forth as they truly come into focus. What makes them up? If you look at the 12th Doctor from the first series, to his first series, and compare it to how he is in his last series, or even the following series, he's almost a different character. And that's not bad writing, that's just proper development. And we definitely see a 13th Doctor who is, in general, she's more willing to try and show mercy. She's more determined to try and not, if possible, kill her enemies. But we also see now, between this and episodes like, what was it, Kerblam? Kerblam. She is willing to make the hard choices when necessary. And she's not going to try and show any more mercy than necessary to a Dalek, because she's not crazy, after all. So, overall, this was a really fun, compelling, interesting episode. But speaking about wrapped up the season, I liked the stuff with Ryan and his dad, and I loved the moment between Graham and Aaron early on in the episode where he lays it all out. Now, you really get some nice payoff to the development between Graham and Ryan throughout the season, that wasn't just lip service, that he really does now see him as his grandfather, that he doesn't just see him as the guy who happened to marry his grandmother. He's family now. He's family, and he cares about him. And that's beautiful and wonderful. I really love the scene between Aaron and Ryan, where Ryan lays out what his father should have done. And yes, to some degree, ultimately he decides he does want a relationship with him, but he also makes it clear it's going to be on his terms, and that he doesn't owe his father anything. That his father abdicated by abdicating responsibility, he also abdicated anything that Ryan might owe him in terms of love and respect, and that he's going to have to earn it. But at the same time, Ryan also does understand in some ways that his father is his father, and that we can only change people so much, and that if he wants him in his life, he's going to have to accept them, flaws and all. And the show, the episode, and the other characters make it clear it's okay if Ryan doesn't want him in his life. If Aaron's not going to earn it, fine. It's okay to cut out toxic elements. But Ryan also does get that at some level he's got to accept his father for who he is. And a lot of this is done subtly. A lot of this is done in glances, in little moments, in little, in quick asides. And that's how you do a relationship like this effectively. And it proves there wasn't an overarching plot for Series 11. There wasn't a single plot line like we got, like Bad Wolf, Torchwood, the Master, any of those kinds of elements, the crack in the wall, all that kind of stuff. There was none of that, the hybrid, in this season. Not really. But we did have an overarching plot, and it was an emotional one. And I thought that was the right choice. This has just been a really interesting episode of Doctor Who in general, because in some ways, this is the closest the series has come to returning to its classic roots. And I mean pre-New Who. I mean 5th Doctor, 6th Doctor, 7th Doctor, 1st Doctor, all those previous Doctor eras. This is the closest the show has been to that since it came back. The way that the episodes have truly been largely standalone, in a way that even earlier seasons didn't quite do. And that's partially because the way they would claim to be standalone, to some degrees they would be, but you'd still get like an overarching villain or something that would come in, or an overarching specific plot. And the way the show is focused more on educational elements, and the way the show has refocused the relationship between the Doctor and her companions, and just the execution, everything about this recalls the classic era of Who, but it doesn't feel like a throwback, because at the same time, it's been incredibly progressive in its cast makeup, in its writers, in the stories it's telling, in the themes it's challenging and looking into the ideas it's exploring. This isn't classic Who. I don't think there's very many episodes of this season that you could have effectively done in classic Who, not at the very least about making some massive changes. Even something like Arachnids in the UK would have played out very differently with a different Doctor. Yes, because in part, those other Doctors would have been seen by the other characters as male, and that changes things. And you certainly could have had something like with the Witchfinders in any other era of Who, something like Rosa in any other era of Who, something like Demons of Punjab in any other era of Who. And yeah, I think that's a good thing. When you get episodes that are that strong and still feel of a part with the series, but at the same time feel very distinct to the era that they are in, even if the era is as new as it is, that tells you that the writers and the producers and everybody behind the camera and in front of the camera, they're doing the right things in general. Are there areas where the show could improve? Absolutely. I've talked about any number of them, including, of course, Yaz, who I think is definitely due for more development and more focus next season, and hopefully she's going to get it. Which isn't to say I don't want Ryan and Graham to have anything to do, but I do think it'd be okay if they took a somewhat of a more backseat, because they got the majority of the character arc, along with the Doctor, in this season, across these episodes. And so it's okay. We've kind of hit a plateau for now with their story. There's definitely still elements for both of them to explore. We have not dealt fully with Grace's death yet. I do not believe that, for example, Graham has truly actually made peace with it. I think very clearly he hasn't, and that's kind of an element I think is going to need to come back into focus before his time on the show is all said and done. But I think there's definitely room to go some other places. And we now have gotten to see the Doctor for the first time, the 13th Doctor, encounter a familiar foe. We have a name drop, of course, of Unit, and I can't wait to see some friends of the Doctor see her new incarnation, because there's potential for some really fun moments there. But regardless, it worked great. The Daleks have never been better. This is up there. I would rate Resolution in my top 10 all-time Daleks episodes. I think it is easily one of the best Dalek episodes ever, and I just think it does such a great job of reestablishing the Daleks. And again, the Daleks got really overused for a while there in New Who, and they've largely taken a back seat in more recent seasons. They've shown up from here and there, they've made appearances, but arguably the last episode of Doctor Who to really focus on the Daleks. And I mean the Daleks directly as a threat, not just as an incidental element like they were in The Magician's Apprentice and all that two-parter, which was really a Missy Davros two-hander. The Daleks are there. They're there as an antagonistic force, but they're not really the focus of the episode. No, I think the last episode of this series to really focus on the Daleks was Into the Dalek. And that was back in, what, series Yeah, series 8. That was the first era of the 12th Doctor. That was the second episode of the 12th Doctor era. And arguably that's the last time we've had a really strong focus on the Daleks. Again, the Daleks have shown up since then. They've made appearances, they've had their roles, but I would argue they haven't really been a true focus of an episode like they were in this one. And I think it says something that, much like the titular episode Dalek, a lot can be gained by kind of dialing back on them, by from time to time narrowing the focus, just giving us one or two Daleks, just a handful of Daleks, or just one Dalek, and showing the path of destruction even one Dalek in a rickety, thrown together suit can unleash upon even our own modern era. That really does sell how dangerous these guys are. That even devoid of all their tricks, all their weapons, all their suits, and various gizmos, much like the Doctor herself, even with all that stripped away, the Daleks are still dangerous, unlike almost any other entity in the galaxy. And so, yeah, I think Resolution was a great end to this season. I am not sanguine about the fact it's also going to be the only episode of Doctor Who we're going to get on TV this year. Yeah, Doctor Who isn't coming back till 2020, so this is going to... It's going to have to hold us for a while. Thankfully, there are other outlets for Doctor Who out there, and actually, going ahead into the future, I intend to cover quite a few of them. There have been a number of tie-in novels for the 13th Doctor. There's a 13th Doctor comic, and I'm going to be reviewing in one form or another all of those in the months ahead. I definitely am going to try and help you all keep getting your Doctor fix, but yeah, it's going to be rough, especially with a season this good. Overall, yeah, I would give season 11 of Doctor Who, the first season of the 13th Doctor, a very strong A, and I would in particular give Resolution an A+. This is what Doctor Who should be at its very best.